What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Mortal Shell 2, which released officially on August 20th, but was available a few days before that on the 17th, and is a Souls-like title, sequel of course to Mortal Shell, with its unique shell swapping, or character swapping I guess you could say, mechanic that makes it pretty interesting. But to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time, just to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below to a video that goes over everything I cover, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. But in the case of Mortal Shell 2, I am a little behind the ball, as quite a few people have already 100% this one, but nonetheless, I did in fact pay for this one, no review key or anything. I bought the $60 version, which gave the 3 days head start, so I've had more time with it than would be typically the case for somebody who bought it just normally. Now, the upside to that, with it being a Souls-like type of game, is that I really didn't have to search for anything. All of the guides are up and available for this one. After you beat the game initially, you can go back and explore. New Game Plus starts with most of the map open to you anyway. And there are very few things that are actually missable. There are 3, really. 2 of them are right at the beginning of the game, so you can just keep starting a new game and doing them over and over until you get them. And then the third one is a particular boss that you need to parry, and if you kill him before you do that, obviously you can't get the achievement on that run. You should be able to do that one in New Game Plus, however. Other than those missable things, it's a relatively straightforward experience, and again, thanks to the guide, I didn't really have to spend time looking for any of it. So this went a bit quicker than I would have expected, and I'm going to post a link or two down in the description to some of the guides I personally found really useful for this one, just so you're aware. Let's move on to the overview then. I would describe Mortal Shell 2 as a fun, compact, Souls-like game that is unfortunately dealing with a couple of problems in my experience. Some people may enjoy it, I suppose, but there are really 2 things that stood out to me that I could stand to see changed. Because to be clear, while I think the game is a lot of fun, these things kind of just get in the way of that fun. And this is the checkpoints overall. I think they are a little too spread out. The initial couple of areas are not like this, so you actually don't feel it nearly as much, but once you get past the sort of opening couple of areas, the checkpoints get really few and far between, to the point where it becomes a bit of a slog if you are having trouble to fight through an entire gauntlet of enemies to get to the next one. And unfortunately, this does eventually lead to a situation where you're kind of incentivized to just not do that and continue running past all of them instead, as it's really hard to run through these areas that are unfamiliar to you and retain all of your resources as you do that in order to get to the next checkpoint. And as a result, a lot of stuff just becomes not worth the effort, honestly. On top of that, there's also a bit of an issue, in my opinion, with the progression balance around the shells themselves. So the shells are the characters we will be inhabiting. They each have unique abilities, that kind of thing. However, the game kind of heavily disincentivizes you from actually experimenting with them the way it seems to be a major mechanic to do so. And you can experiment with them, but the issue is a lot of that progression comes by upgrading the shells via your glimpses. Glimpses are the resource you spend on the shells to make them more powerful and unlock their memories. You simply do not get enough glimpses even after the patch that went out on the day 1, the 20th, which made this a little easier by refunding some of the glimpses that were used to actually find the shells on the world map. Like, it'll mark them if you pay some glimpses for them. But you're likely going to do that because it's available right away before you realize that glimpses are a very limited resource, and so they changed how that worked. But I don't think that goes far enough, because oftentimes, and with the way they're spread out, you're finding these shells, but you've already heavily invested into one of them most likely, and because of the way those upgrades work, you are really not incentivized at all to switch and experiment up with them until you get pretty late into the game, at which point it's probably unnecessary anyway, and it just feels a little bit off in my opinion. And because the game is so much fun in every other respect, it just feels like a bit of a bummer in particular right there. Next, let's move on and talk about the technical state of this one. So how's this game running? For me, it ran very well. I only had a couple of minor freezes on occasion, and it was really good otherwise. Very smooth experience. I haven't really seen anybody else complaining about performance with this one either, so while I suppose it's possible there might be some bigger issues that people are running into, I have not experienced that. Otherwise, though, it's looking pretty good. So let's move on to difficulty. And while this is a Souls-like and has a set difficulty, as is often the case, we do occasionally see difficulty settings. And what we see here are in-game options to tune the difficulty a little farther. By equipping the Slayer seal, you can effectively make the game much, much easier by giving yourself a near infinite amount of resolve. and the ability to break enemies really, really quickly. The catch with the Slayer Seal is that it turns achievements off, so if that matters to you, don't use it, and the game will warn you about this. But on the opposite end, if you want to make the game harder, a little ways into the game, you will find an item that you can take to an NPC at your base camp, Marrow Keep, and doing so will allow you to activate a harder version where enemies are more deadly. Now, I will say Nightmare is not really necessary for anything, like the baseline difficulty is what the game seems to actually care about, but there are some things that are very minor relatively that are available in night mode. And I will also say that even in normal mode, a lot of the in-game bosses are very capable of one-shotting you from full health down to completely zero through your shell and your Harbinger, which I'll explain in a moment. So certainly something to keep in mind, I suppose. Now, on top of that, there is a New Game Plus, but it is a little bit different than you might expect, as it kind of continues the story, you could say. So the story here is very minimal, and that continuation of the story is just meant to like give you an excuse to go through the iterations again, so it's not like a new ending or anything like that. But this also means they had a little bit of freedom to not only carry your progression over, but also allow you access to parts of the map that under normal circumstances you wouldn't get access to immediately. And so when you get through the base game and into New Game Plus, it is actually much faster as a result, because you can just beeline it for the bosses, you know where everything is. If you took your time in the base game, you likely have everything already, and you're just focused on the fights. Now, they do increase in difficulty a little bit, but if you got through the base game, you'll almost certainly be fine in New Game Plus. Keeping it moving, let's next up talk about the story setup for this one. So the story for this game is relatively minimal. It's there, but it's kind of bare bones, and the focus is really the action. In Mortal Shell 2, we are the Harbinger of the Undermether. The Undermether is a being that fell to the face of this planet and was eventually worshipped as a deity, but there was some corruption that seems to have hitched a ride on the thing that slowly corrupted it and the rest of the world, alongside the eggs or the ova of the Undermether. However, one of those eggs managed to escape corruption and became our character, the Harbinger. Your job is basically to go around and collect the eggs from the world and try to put a stop to all of this corruption. And that is pretty much what the story is. That's going to take you around the world battling this corruption, fighting off these enemies that have been corrupted. And while there is certainly a little bit of lore that goes into the backstory of like the major bosses and stuff, I mean, it's there if you want it, but it's not like a huge focus by any means. And the story is, again, relatively minimal, so it's fine. It serves its purpose. And so let's talk instead about progression. So progression in this game comes down to several different things, starting with the level of your base Harbinger. So your base Harbinger, you will level up the traditional Souls way. As you kill things, you get a resource called Gloom. You can spend that Gloom on upgrading your Harbinger, increasing your base, which includes damage, how easy it is to use your shells and their improvements, etc. So that's the base level, and then on top of that, you'll be leveling up the individual shells or the characters that you will put on top of your Harbinger. So you do this by spending glimpses. Back in Marrow Keep, there is this very large woman who you will give glimpses to allow you to bond with these shells, which makes them more effective in combat and thus more useful to you. As I already mentioned at the beginning, the game does not give you enough glimpses, even after they somewhat address this in the Day 1 patch, and while I think you don't necessarily need to be able to max out every one of these shells in a single playthrough, more than like 3 would be nice, as there are 8 of them total. But that's just sort of your base ability. On top of that, there's then your loadout. So while each individual shell is typically associated with a weapon, a sidearm, and stuff like that, you can actually freely swap these out. None of them are assigned to a shell, and so your loadout consists of your shell, your weapon, your sidearm, your seals, and your tar stones. All of this stuff can be upgraded by upgrading the forge back at your base camp as well to make them even stronger, but not all that unlike the shells. Some of these, to make them genuinely better, require a heavy investment of resources, especially things like gold, etc., that make it a bit difficult to max them all out, which again kind of pushes you towards a singular playstyle instead of the experimentation that the game seems to be trying to let you do, but by the time you open up that experimentation, it's like you don't have anything left to do. So I don't love how that feels personally, but there's 8 different weapons, 8 different sidearms. One of the sidearms is a lute, which I thought was really funny and leans into the sort of heavy metal vibe they are going for. Then there's your seals. Seals are effectively your defensive bit of equipment. They affect how you block and guard and all of that. So there's a few different ones, but it basically comes down to harden, block, or parry, and then the Slayer seal, which is for difficulty. But one of the seals allows you to harden, basically turning into stone instead of taking the hit. This one's a little awkward to use in my opinion, and so I'd say block and parry are the more normal ones. Block is your standard seal. That's the one you start the game with. If you time it just right, you will perfectly block, which does get a little confusing because sometimes the game refers to this perfect block as a parry, like with the perfect parry achievement. That's actually talking about the perfect block from this seal. However, there's another seal that is literally a parry. The timing on that is much more difficult, but is more rewarding because you will stagger the enemy more if you time it correctly. So that's certainly something to know. And then there are your tar stones. In total, you can equip a bunch of different tar stones. These are effectively little accessories that you can put on a character that are divided up into several types, like active and support. You can upgrade these also, which gives you greater and greater effects with them, and also gives you access to certain abilities and whatnot. One of my favorites caused you to slash and then jump up into the air to do a big hit, which would not only knock back the enemy, but you also are completely immune to everything while that attack is taking place, which was just super useful. But there's over like 70 of these, and they each come with their different abilities and whatnot, so there's a lot of customization between all of those different things, which then brings us to the gameplay and world section. So like many Souls-like, this game is about checkpoints and reaching the next one, resetting enemy placements, leveling up at those checkpoints, using it for all of your other progress, etc. Now, we do have a home base in the middle of the map called Marrow Keep. This is where we do all of our big upgrades, like upgrading our shells, upgrading our weapons and stuff at the forge, talking to the vendor there. But the rest of the game is, I would say, a compact open world. It is not like a truly open world setup, but there are large areas and biomes that you are free to explore at your own pace, and a lot of times these are separated by little gates that will send you flying from one to the next. But in the larger open areas themselves, you can find things like little mini dungeons as well as the larger dungeons for the major bosses. So the mini dungeons are kind of what you saw in like Elden Ring, where you could find these little like tombs and stuff that weren't very long, but there would potentially be some enemies in there, maybe a little boss at the end of it, that kind of thing. And naturally some rewards, of course. All of these are separated across several different biomes, and as we kill and loot everything we can in these, we are going to find our typical resources. You're going to pick up actual money, your resource gloom, and you can even find some side quests along the way. As this world is heavily corrupted, we can find all sorts of interesting things going on. There is a tavern. That's where you can find things like the loot, which lets you play some heavy metal, which I thought was really funny as a sidearm. One of the first areas you see has you running around a little coven with like hags and stuff in it, and they have these little circular stones set up that if you pass through will alter the environment in small ways. We see that in some of the dungeons as ways to alter things. There's your typical secrets, your hidden walls, that kind of stuff. They do a pretty good job of marking the hidden passages with like the destroyable walls, that kind of stuff. They're usually marked with like a symbol somewhere. Sometimes you have to just kind of use your own inference, but there are plenty of secrets to find, things like that. Most of that stuff's already been found. You can look up guides for it, as I mentioned, but that kind of thing keeps the exploration on top of the rewards you get for doing it a lot of fun. And I think it's actually one of the better parts of this because the compact version of this open world keeps it from getting too overwhelming or you getting lost. It's a very focused experience without being too repetitive, and I think that's pretty remarkable in and of itself. But as I mentioned, the problem this runs into is that the checkpoints are just too far in between. Outside of the first couple of areas, which I actually think they do a better job with, the area in particular that had the open beta, so probably not a surprise there, but everywhere else, I feel like they could stand to pepper a few more of them in there. Otherwise, let's talk about combat. So combat, as with any Souls-like, is going to have some similarities, but there are still some things I want to focus on in particular, such as the resolve, the stagger, your shell abilities, and some other things. So, resolve is this game's version of a stamina bar. We do not have a stamina bar. However, we do have to focus on resolve. As you attack enemies, you build up resolve. Resolve is then going to let you use your sidearm as well as any tar stone abilities, things like that. They all work off of resolve. One of the ways I found to sort of exploit this a little bit, I'm sure, is that strike that gave me all those iframes I mentioned a bit earlier would knock the enemy down after. And once I had a high amount of resolve towards the end game, what I could do is use that ability, cause the knockdown on the enemy, immediately follow up with a bunch of heavy attacks to give me enough resolve to do it again and effectively stun lock enemies this way. And so for reasons like that, resolve is really, really important. Now, enemies have a stagger bar, especially bosses. It's kind of the same color, but as you perfectly defend against enemies, you will build up their stagger bar, and then there's a few other ways to potentially build it up as well, depending on the characters and stuff you're using. But the gist is perfectly defend yourself, and you will build up stagger on the enemy. And when it fills, the enemy is staggered, and you can do a big hit for a ton more damage than normal. That part is pretty standard Souls-like stuff, but where it gets interesting are your shell abilities. Well, almost all of the footage I'm going to show you here, outside of a couple of instances, are me using one of the shells called Teal. There are several different others that each have their own base effects and abilities that you can empower. Now, in addition to the progression I mentioned earlier, you can, as you level up, assign skill points to these shells, which can allow them to focus in on things. But like I said, you're also kind of de-incentivized from trying to experiment too much because of how heavily you need to invest in these shells. Teal is one of the first ones you pick up. He's kind of right at the beginning of the game, and he has a really useful ability straight away that makes you immune to poison, and there's a lot of poison in the area you find him in, unsurprisingly. So that ability is super, super useful, and you are probably going to then spend your glimpses to upgrade him specifically for that, only to then realize that you suddenly don't have enough glimpses to upgrade the shells you subsequently find, which disincentivizes you again from trying them out and experimenting because they just won't be as strong. And that's kind of what I'm talking about here, and it's why most of my footage is with this one guy, because the time you can truly freely experiment, you don't have anything left to do, which I think is a bummer. Now, the upside to that is you can a little more easily change out your loadouts via like tar stones, as well as your weapon and sidearms, because they are not attached to the shells themselves and have their own separate upgrade paths. The forge also has the ability to smelt down weapons and get those upgrades back and put them into other weapons. And so while it is still expensive to do that and have multiple weapons, you can mess around with the weaponry much more than the shells themselves, but each shell does have a unique ability. And so if I were to recommend this game to someone, I would actually almost tell you to do a little bit of research and try to see which shell you want to play around with first, because until they fix this, it really was a point of frustration for me in particular, because I actively wanted to play more of it. I wanted to play around and mess around with those shells more, but it felt like a huge cut to my power to do so because of the way they set the progression up. Either way though, those shells have different abilities. Teal has the ability to go invisible, which can really mess with boss AI, by the way. Sometimes they get stuck in their little animations just attacking away at nothing because they don't know where you went. The others can do some cool stuff too, like the caked up robot looking lady. Proxima has her biosampler ability. Janessa makes these like clones of herself, that kind of stuff. In the case of Mortal Shell 2, when the shell you are using gets brought to low health, you do not immediately lose. Rather, you get sent back to your Harbinger form. And what happens then is if you can deal enough damage as the Harbinger, which is going to be weaker without your shell, mind you, if you can do enough damage, you can actually revive your shell and take on their form again, and they recover health based on the level of your bond. And so that way, the game is a little more tolerant of mistakes, which is, I think, why they probably went for the enemy damage in the late game. So, like I mentioned, some of the bosses are capable of just like fully annihilating you, and I think it's because of the way this works everywhere else. And I noticed in particular it was the grapple attacks. So a lot of bosses have a grapple ability, and especially, again, the in-game bosses, if that grapple hits you, you are just dead. It doesn't matter how much health you had. And while I don't love that personally, I am kind of curious if that was in a response to the fact that it's relatively easy to avoid death otherwise, outside of just like, getting ganged up on quicker than you can react. They give you a lot of opportunities to backpedal before you get to that point. So putting all of that together, a lot of combat is just finding the combination you really want to use, and because of the way the progression is, unfortunately kind of sticking with it. So it comes down to, again, the abilities from your shell, your equipped tar stones, as well as your weapon, your sidearm, and that kind of makes up your overall build. And while they're simple and straightforward enough, I do, again, just to hammer it home here, really wish they'd let you experiment more. That does, however, bring us to the Steam Deck and Steam Machine. So, interesting situation here for the Steam Deck and Steam Machine. The game does run pretty well on the Steam Deck, surprisingly so. I honestly kind of didn't think it was going to do very well there, but it looks like in order to make that happen, they locked like the graphical settings and stuff. So if you're playing it on the Steam Deck, it does seem to pretty much be locked in at the settings it has. And that does seem to be a manageable 30 or so FPS yes, even if the graphics, of course, take a hit on that smaller screen. Now, the official rating dings it as playable for small text on some screens, which is very true, and the way it displays some of its icons. But you should definitely be able to play on the Steam Deck if you really wanted to, which again surprised me a little bit. But on the Steam machine side of things, it is much better. Now, Steam once again gave them a rating of playable over here, specifically because of the non-Steam controller icons showing up. But if that doesn't bother you, this game runs very, very well on the Steam machine. I would say you're probably not going to be playing it in 4K on that machine, but otherwise it was a really good experience. Again, I'm a big fan of the Steam controller, and this game naturally has controller support either way, so all of that combined and just the bigger hardware of the Steam machine makes this a much better experience on that specific bit of hardware. So if you wind up picking it up on Steam or something, it should transfer over to that super well. But that ultimately brings us to our positives, negatives, and then we'll wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, I had a lot of fun exploring. I had a lot of fun messing around with stuff like the loadouts. I really enjoyed the possibilities you could set up there. I enjoyed the art direction. I enjoyed the more focused and compact nature of the map and everything. Like I said, it manages to do a lot without feeling repetitive, and I think that part was well done. And as I have hopefully made abundantly clear over the course of this review, when it comes to negatives, it's primarily the way the game balances progression. Like, I think you should be able to experiment more freely with this stuff. It's clearly like the hallmark of the game, and they make it like weirdly difficult to do that, and by the time you are able to kind of freely experiment as you please, like there's nothing left to do, the game's over. And then the other part is I just wish the checkpoints were more abundant. They're a little too far. They do, again, great in the first couple of areas, and then it falls off a cliff. And that can get frustrating in places, but that brings me to my conclusion. I mostly had a great time with Mortal Shell 2. There are a couple of things I would like to see tweaked and patched, but I don't know if they're going to bother to do that. Some of this is probably certainly my preference, but mostly I would just describe it as a situation where I want to play more of your game, and I would like you to make it easier for me to do that. And if that is what my complaints can be summed up as, I think we're in a pretty good place. And for that reason, with this game being $50 US over on Steam, which again I did pay for, and more specifically I paid the $60 version so I could play it a couple of days early, I had a great time with it. I think it's well worth a buy, which is where we are going to leave this review. So hopefully you found that useful. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about this one down in the comment section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.